Well, good morning and welcome to SouthCrest. We are so glad that you are here with us today, that you all made it through last night's little sprinkle or whatever it was. We are so glad you guys have joined us. We are in the middle of our study of the book of Ruth this morning, and I hope everyone had a good Valentine's Day, and you're welcome. To all of you who used the Christian pickup lines I gave last week, and because of that, we're able to get a date and have a Valentine's date. So I do what I can to help make your lives better. So if you miss it, you can go back and watch next week. At the beginning, I give about 10 really solid Christian pickup lines for anybody who needs help in finding relationships. But this month, we've been looking at the book of Ruth. We've been walking through chapter by chapter what this book is about. In the first week, we talked about love and the loyalty of love and what that means to stay true and stay connected to one another. Last week, we looked a little bit at Ruth and Boaz's dating relationship. We talked about the importance of having the character that you want your future spouse to have. That if you don't have that character now, you can't expect that character to be available to you because like likes like. And so that works together that way. And we saw how Ruth and Boaz were both people of honor, that they were both people who had a good reputation, and that they were both people who were patient and waited on God's time, didn't try to rush something and make something that wasn't there. And so we saw this connection that they had together. And today, we're gonna look at chapter 3 and look at this idea of a sacrificial love, a love that gives and does more than it receives. And so, I remember very clearly the day that I proposed to Angie. It was Saturday, August 7th, 1999. I had the perfect day planned, culminating in a hot air balloon ride right before sunset. Needless to say, we pulled up. I was meeting the guy in front of a Bi-Lo grocery store, and so I'm taking Angie, and we stop at this Bi-Lo, and she's like, why are we at a Bi-Lo grocery store? I'm like, just wait. You know, and then the guy pulls up with the hot air balloon, and she's like, oh my goodness. And so we get in the hot air balloon, and we go up on this amazing trip. And what's so cool is like we're floating by, and there was this guy who was driving his truck, and he pulled off the side of the road and got his little kid out, and they were down there waving at us. You know, we were waving back at them. And there were people who would come out on their porches of their house and just wave at us. And you could see the horses and deer running down below on the ground. It was just such an amazing time. And you would think that a sunset hot air balloon ride in South Carolina countryside, you know, would be the perfect setting and backdrop for me to get down on one knee and to look at the love of my life, my best friend, and say, will you marry me? Yeah, it didn't happen that way. Not at all. First of all, hot air balloons, not quiet at all, okay? Like when they're up 1,000 feet in the sky and you see them going by, you're like, wow, they're just so peaceful and calm. No, you know why they call them hot air balloons? They need hot air. And so they accomplish that by having this huge basic jet turbine engine in the booth with them, right? And so you go to talk, and you hear this, and I was like, okay, never mind, you know? And you don't want to fall down out of the hot air balloon, so that happens often. Like lots, okay? This was also August in South Carolina, which is very similar to Georgia in August. So it was already a hot day. And then once again, there was this huge turbine engine producing heat right there. I mean, we were dripping in sweat. It was so gross. And then the baskets are not like this huge open area. The basket was like 4x4, right? And most of it was taken up by the said jet turbine engine, right? And so Angie and I are in this basket, and our pilot was in there as well, because I guess you need one of those. And he was a very robust man. He looked like Santa Claus. No kidding. He had a long white beard, and he had a bowl full of jelly for a belly. I mean, you kind of bump into him like, woo, you know, and so there wasn't a lot of space for me to get down on a knee. And then on top of that, I had saved up a lot of money to buy this ring, and I'm 1,000 feet in the air, and the last thing I want to do is like fumble in my pocket, boop, oh, hey, you know, not good. So I was like, yeah, this is not happening in the air at all. You know, and so I'm just sitting there like, we're just gonna go for a ride. You know, and the ride gets done, and we land, and we help Santa Claus pack up the balloon, and then like, then I drive somewhere else and ask her to marry me. And of course, she said yes. But I mean, it was a great day. It was a very momentous day, a very memorable day for us, but it definitely did not go as I envisioned it and as I had planned it out, okay? That did not happen. And I think most of you have probably had in your lifetime a plan that didn't quite work out the way you wanted it to, right? And planning's a good thing. Planning is something that we need to do. And problem is sometimes they work out and then maybe sometimes they don't. And we find ourselves in these situations where it's like, okay, I planned on this did not happen. What do we do now? And I think we like to plan things out because we like to have control of the situation, or at least the illusion that we're in control of the situation. And so we like to make plans, and plans are by definition good. I mean, all of you have a plan for tomorrow. It may be a very boring plan. It may be I'm going to work, or I'm going to school, but it's still a plan. You know what you're doing. Some of you have plans for later on today. Some of you are more concerned about where you're going to eat after church than where you were coming to church, right? I mean, some things are important. And so you're making plans. You're trying to figure out what it is that we need to do. And again, plans are good. If you're going skiing in Colorado, a good plan helps make that happen, because if you don't, you might end up with a beach ball and swim trunks and not really ski gear. So making plans is important. Maybe you're planning a wedding like some of us are for later this year. And there's a lot of things that happen in a wedding, a lot of things that you want to make sure go right. And so you make a plan and you hope everything goes according to plan. And if you're like other people, you make plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. You have all the plans. So when one goes wrong, you can just fall back onto the other. And if you have an outside wedding like we're going to do, you always have a rain plan because you don't know what the weather is going to do. And so you have to have plans. They're not bad things. And today we're going to see that when it comes to love, sometimes you need a plan. Not necessarily to fall in love, not necessarily but to show love, you need a plan. To show love takes intentionality. It takes effort. It's something that you have to think about and say, I'm going to do something for someone else, especially if that love is a sacrificial love. Especially if that love is going to be one that requires you to give up something, you're going to have a plan for that. And we're going to see today in chapter 3 that this is what's happening, that there's a love that needs to be expressed and there's going to be a plan. So if you go back to last week, we talked about kind of Ruth and Boaz kind of liking each other, kind of starting to maybe try to get this idea of dating going on, of like, hey, I think you're cute, here's some extra grain, and hey, hang out in my fields. I got good fields. You know, all that kind of stuff that Boaz was doing. And when Ruth got home, Naomi picked up on it pretty quickly, right? She was like, hey, you like him, he likes you. And as any good mother or future mother-in-law would be, was like, how do we get these two together, right? What do I need to do to make this happen? Because they're kind of slow, dragging their feet, and I need this thing to happen, right? So Naomi devises a plan, and that's where we pick up in chapter 3. So if you have your Bibles, you'd open to Ruth chapter 3. If not, it'll be on the screen here. Verse 1, then Naomi left her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. So up to this point, all the interactions we see between Ruth and Boaz are occurring in a field, in a farmer's field. In other words, they're at work, which also probably means that they're not the cleanest, not the most well-presented people at that time. If you're working in the field, you're probably a little dirty, a bunch of dust, and you're walking around, you're kind of sweaty because you're doing manual labor and all this stuff. And so despite of all of that, they still find each other and like each other, right? And so Naomi's like, hey, here's the thing. I have a plan, and I think we need to execute this plan. So basically what's happening is the harvest is over, and what the landowners would do is basically have a party to celebrate a successful harvest. And they would kind of dress up, and they would have food, and they would bring people, and they would celebrate what they had done. And so Boaz is going to be a little bit nicer dressed. This is a celebration. He's not going out to work in the fields. It's kind of the icing on the cake type moment. So he's dressed up, got his good garments on, and he's like, I'm going to celebrate. And Naomi knows this, and she tells Ruth, hey, go get a shower, go get cleaned up, anoint yourself with oil, put some perfume on, make yourself all pretty, and you need to go to this party. But here's the thing. When you go to this party, kind of hide in the shadows until Boaz goes to sleep. You see, these parties were kind of fun, and so Boaz just found a place near the grain pile, and he laid down to go to sleep. And she was like, when he does that, uncover his feet, lay down next to him, and wait for him to tell you what to do next. That's the plan, okay? So that's what we're going to do. Picking up in verse 5. And she replied, being Ruth, all that you say, I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." So Ruth, we see, agrees to this plan. Like, makes sense to her. It's a good plan. She agrees to the plan. She goes to the party. She hangs out in the dark shadows, waits until he falls asleep, and she quietly sneaks in, uncovers his feet, and lays down next to him. Now, when I first read this when I was younger, I would read this uncover your feet part and be like, what's up with that? Right? Was this some kind of tradition or some kind of custom they did? And the answer is no, it's not. The answer is common sense. All right, when you fall asleep and somebody uncovers your feet, at some point in the night, you're going to wake up because guess what? Your feet are cold. And Naomi knew he's going to wake up because this was a desert area. It's hot during the day and it's cold at night. When I worked at Kia, I went out to the desert out there, and we went to the proving grounds. And during the day, it was 85 degrees. In the morning, we had to scrape ice off of our cars because it was like 20 degrees. And that's how it was. So, you go to bed, it's nice and warm. At some point that night, it's going to be really, really cold. And he's going to realize my feet are uncovered. Now, here's a problem, right? He's going to wake up, realize his feet are uncovered, and now somebody's laying next to him. Yeah, when I went to bed, there was nobody here. And now I wake up, and there's somebody here. So he's what? Startled, it says. He's like, whoa, hey, there's a person here. Who are you? It's dark. It's nighttime. Last night we had storms, right? Woke up about 4:30 with the storms. Turned on to Channel 9 News in Columbus. They do a great job of advertising that. But at some point, one of the guys was like, hey, let's go to the sky cam on top of the St. Francis Hospital's parking garage and see what we can see. My first thing is, it's 4:30 in the morning and it's pouring down rain. You know what we saw? Gray. That's what it was, it's gray. Because it's dark outside. You can't see anything. And then it's pouring down rain. So Ruth is there at night, it's dark, no one can see her. He's like, who's here? There's a body here. Who is that? And it's Ruth. But what happens next is the most interesting part, I think, in all of this story that we're going to talk about today, is that Ruth proposes to Boaz. Ruth breaks tradition and she proposes. She says in Ruth 3:9, the last part, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. You see, Ruth knew that typically a man would make the first move, that she'd have to wait for him to say, hey, I want to marry you. And she knew that what she was doing would appear scandalous, would be under suspicion. So she went in the dead of night. She waited till no one knew she was there. She snuck in because she was worried about what other people might say. She knew how much she might lose, but that didn't stop Ruth. So in the dark, vulnerable, she creeps in, hoping, trusting that Boaz will respond in the good way. And such was the way that Ruth asked Boaz to marry her, to take me as your wife. Picking up in verse 10, it says this, and he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight. In the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So this potentially embarrassing moment highlights what makes Boaz a worthy man, what makes him a worthy husband, and at the same time highlights why Ruth is a worthy woman, one that's the same thing, like we talked about last week. They both have that same character about them. And as scandalous as we might seem that Ruth will lay down next to Boaz in the middle of the night when he didn't know she was there, in God's eyes, there was no impurity happening here. In God's eyes, his law was being honored. We see a lot of beautiful glimpses of Ruth in all 4 chapters of this book. We've talked about a lot of them already. But this is the only place, right after this happens, right after Ruth lays down next to Boaz in the middle of the night, we find the only place where she's called a worthy woman. In this moment, this is where her worth comes in. Listen, she has been a worthy woman the entire time. She was worthy when her husband died. She was worthy when her mother-in-law was left alone. She was worthy when she was in a foreign land. She was worthy when she came back and stayed true to her mother-in-law. She was worthy when she worked in the fields every day and never ceased to work and worked very hard. She was worthy even here in the darkness on the threshing room floor, waiting at the feet of the man she wanted to marry. You see, a truly worthy person is worthy in secret and in public. There's no difference. And Ruth was worthy. The townspeople talked about how worthy she was. Everyone who knew her, who met her, who saw her, could tell that she was worthy. And this is what Boaz praises her about. She could have sought a younger person to marry. Remember, when we find out who Boaz is, he's a relative of Elimelech, which means he's probably, because they dropped Elimelech's name, near an age to Elimelech. He's an older man. And she's a young woman. And Ruth says, this is who I'm going to pursue. But listen, that last kindness that he talks about is not just the fact that she picked him as a older man who's probably past his prime to be her husband, but Boaz is not an idiot. He knows why she is asking, and why she's asking is not for her. She's asking for Naomi. She promised to watch after, take care of Naomi. She said, Naomi, where you live, I will live, and where you die, I will die. And she has a chance to marry a redeemer who can restore Naomi, to restore Naomi's lands, to restore Naomi's name, to restore Naomi in her people. And Ruth says, I will get married for you, Naomi. And this is what Boaz recognizes. That, hey, you coming back with her and staying with her and living with her and doing all you promised is worthy and kind. But you marrying me, a much older man, and not chasing after young rich people, but focusing on me because I can redeem your mother-in-law, that's incredible. And Boaz recognizes that. And he blesses her. He says, blessed are you. He sees that character that's so strong in her, that honor, that good reputation, that worthiness. And if anything, it makes her love her all the more. Picking up in verse 14, it says this. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And then finished with saying, she replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle that matter today. So before the sun rises, before you can be recognized, in other words, while it's still dark, she wakes up to go home, but Boaz doesn't let her go empty-handed. He says, hey, come over here and that garment you have, hold it out. And he put 6 measures of barley into that garment. 6 measures of barley sounds like a very kind gesture. When I read what 6 measures of barley was, I kind of like, that's not really that nice, because that's about 50 pounds worth of barley. So, hey, come here. Here's 50 pounds to carry home, basically. But that first story we read about where she got the 6 ephah, we said that was about a 5 or 6 gallon bucket worth of barley. 50 pounds is about double or triple that. This is a whole lot more he's giving her. Again, providing and taking care of her and doing all of that. And also having her go before people come so she's not ashamed, he's not ashamed. It's this plan they have worked out, right? And she gets home, and guess what happens? Naomi's waiting on her, right? And this makes perfect sense, right? You came up with a plan, you sent her out on the plan, and you want to know, did the plan work, right? Did this happen? So she's probably sitting on the front doorstep going, come on home, right? And she comes in and is like, yeah, tell me how it went. And this is what we do with Ben. Ben comes home from work, and we're like, hey, tell us how your day was. And he's like, just a minute, hold on. And he starts going into every detail of every day, and like, I don't care, right? I want to know the good stuff. Tell me the good stuff, and then you can talk about the other stuff later. And so Ruth starts off by doing what? Well, I got some barley. He gave me some food. She's like, I don't care about the food. I want to know, did he ask you to marry? Like, I want to know, are you being redeemed? Like, great, I'm glad we have some more food to eat, but hey, the plan was not for you to go get more food. The plan was you to get married. How is that going, right? And she tells him, well, he said that there was another redeemer closer by and that he was going to see about it. And I was like, yeah, he's going to see about it. He's not going to rest today until this is taken care of. Like, this is such a big deal, and because of the kindness he's shown you, I know Boaz is gonna make sure by the end of today, we're gonna know if you're redeemed by him or redeemed by the other guy. And listen, being redeemed by the other guy is not a bad thing. Everything we just talked about, the redemption brought, Naomi being restored and all that happening would have happened with the other kinsman redeemer. It's just Ruth had never met him, but she knew Boaz. So Boaz is gonna take care of this. He's got something invested in this. So he's gonna make sure he can do all he can. So this is where we stop today with that story of Ruth as this kind of cliffhanger of what's gonna happen with Boaz. If you wanna know, you come back next Sunday and you'll find out exactly what happens, the rest of the story. But as I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at how this occurs, the question we have to ask that we ask every week is, okay, what does this part of scripture have to do with us? Right? What can we take from Ruth chapter 3 and apply to our lives today? I don't recommend that any of you walk into some random dude's barn tonight and lay down at their feet. That's not what we're gonna do, right? But there's something here that we need to understand, and that's that there's this example set forth of sacrificial love. You see, Ruth and Naomi both sacrifice a lot for the other's benefit. And we see that Boaz is gonna sacrifice. And we see this model of sacrificial love that's given. And sacrificial love is important. And it's in a lot of the areas of our lives. But I think the biggest impact on this type of love and the biggest impact it has on our friends and families is within the context of marriage. And I think we see Paul teaching something very similar when it comes to the relationships with husband and wives that we see what's happening with both Boaz and Ruth. So in the book of Ephesians, Paul begins to talk about how a marriage love should look. Chapter 5, verse 22, it says this: "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands." Now, here we see wives being called to submit to their husbands. And listen, if I'm gonna be honest with you, this is where a lot of people stop. And man, there's so many times in scripture, we read a part of a verse that we either like or we don't like, and we stop there. Right? Because if we don't like the idea of women having to submit, we're gonna shut down and be like, the Bible's wrong, the Bible's mean. And if a guy's reading, he's like, oh, I love this part. You're supposed to submit to me. Yeah, there's more to it. There's this thing called context. There's reasons for that submission, all right? And so before we get too worked up over this idea of submission, I'm gonna ask you a question. Do you even know what the word submit means? Do you have any clue what it means to submit? Because I guarantee you if you're mad at this verse, then you have no clue what this word means. If you're a big fan of this verse, you have no clue what this word means. 1828, Noah Webster's dictionary says this: "Submit means to yield, resign, or surrender to the power, will, or authority of another with the reciprocal pronoun." What word is not in there? Obey. It doesn't mean to obey. It means to yield. It means to resign, surrender. It means you make a choice in your relationship to let someone else make the final say with the reciprocal pronoun. Why is that important? Because I had no clue what a reciprocal pronoun was. I don't like English at all. I hate it. And I'm not gonna learn about, look, I struggled enough to know what a pronoun was, much less a reciprocal pronoun, all right? But I had to learn what a reciprocal pronoun is. Here's what a reciprocal pronoun is. It's a pronoun used that implies that it's not something that you do, but it's something also done unto you. It reciprocates. So when you're called to submit with the reciprocal pronoun, that means at times you will have to yield your desires, your wishes. You will choose to let somebody else have the say, but at other times, the other person will choose to submit to you. At other times, that person will say, no, we're gonna go with your idea. No, we're gonna go with your plan. It's mutual submission. It's something we do with one another. There's not one who's over it. That's why it's not obey. To submit is to choose. It's a give and take relationship. Look at a sacrificial give and take relationship based on that kind of love. And that is a big distinction when we're called to submit because we love one another. If you truly love someone, the idea of submitting should not be that hard. It should be easy. If you love me and I love you, then I know you have my best interest at heart. So why would I second guess what you're choosing to do? because I trust you. It's not a hard thing to do because love's about what you give, not about what you get. Picking back up in verse 25, it says this, husband loves your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So reciprocal pronouns, right? Wives are to submit, husbands are called to submit as well. But there's more, guys. Hey, as husbands, guess what? You don't stop there. You're called to sacrifice. How much? As Christ loved the church and laid down his life for her. So, let me paint this picture. Wives are called to submit. In other words, wives are called to listen to their husbands sometimes, yield, make choices based on love. Husbands, you're called to die. That's just what the Bible says. Husbands, it ain't about you at all. And what's on top of that is God's going to hold you responsible for your family. Great day for dads. Yeah, not only are you called to mutually submit to your wife, you're also called to die for her. And when you get to heaven, God's going to look at how well you led your family. Not her. Because she submitted to your leadership. She gets that whole, well, he told me to. Oh yeah, he did, didn't he? Idiot. That's how it's going to happen. So if I'm a woman right now, this idea of submitting to my husband is sounding really, really good. Because I get to choose when he's not being an idiot to listen to him and honor God. And when he is, I don't have to submit to him because he's not under a God's authority. You see, all of this falls under what God's called us to do. It's all under his umbrella of what God has done and has set the example for. And so that's what we're called to do. Picking back up in verse 28, if that wasn't enough, it says more. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Husbands, you're to love your wives in such a way because they're not part of you. They're part of who God has called you to be. Wives, you're to love your husbands because the two of you are now one. Verse 32 picks back up saying this mystery is profound. I'm saying that refers to Christ and the church. And then verse 33 goes on, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. That very last verse reminds me of one of my favorite Martin Luther quotes. He says this, let the wife make the husband glad to come home, and let him make her sorry to see him leave. What a beautiful picture of what marriage should be. What sacrificial love is supposed to be. You see, before we move on, we got to look back at this context thing. Because what you see here in Ephesians 5 at the very beginning is called walk in love. Verses 1 and 2 say this, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. You see, then he goes on to explain a little bit more like walking in love looks like. And then he says, let me show you some examples. The very first one, husband and wife. But you know what happens in chapter 6 right after that? Children and parents. You know what happens later in chapter 6 after that? Masters and servants. You see, what God's doing is he's saying, here, let me help you out. One, I'm going to prioritize your relationships. Me first, as God. The very next thing that's important, husband and wife. After that, your kids. Some of you need to hear that today and make that note. Your spouse is to be loved more than your kids. Not by my call, by God's. I'm at the age of my life where my kids are starting to get ready to move out. Doesn't change how much I love them. But never forget this, Angie and I chose to be married to each other. We made a lifetime commitment to one another. We decided together to have these rugrats. We knew we'd only have them for about 20 years each. That's Sometimes a bit too long, if you ask me. We could get them out a little bit sooner. Back in the Bible times, they were out at 13. I like that. You get them on out, People always like, well, you're going to miss them when they're gone. No, I'm not. Really not. They can come by and visit, and I'll see them from time to time. I'm good. Really, I am. Okay? But here's the thing about it. I do love you, Ben, really. Yeah. He's my favorite son. And I have $3. Looks like, hey, she's all bitter because I said I love Ben. So, okay. It's all good. But here's the thing about it, guys. Your spouse is the biggest relationship you have. Christ doesn't model himself and show an example between parents and kids. He shows it between a marriage relationship. And that's what we're called to love one another. Sacrificial love. It's about marriage, about what you give, not what you get. And I know some of you are like, well, I'm not married, so this message doesn't apply to me today. No, it does. It does. Because I want you to see, when this started, it wasn't about marriage alone. Naomi is focused on making sure Ruth is in good shape. Chapter 1, Naomi says, why would you come home with me? Do I have more kids in my womb? Do I have someone you can marry? And even if I did, you'd have to wait 20 years for them to get old enough to marry them. But Ruth committed herself to Naomi. So Naomi's constantly looking out, how can I take care of Ruth? Not how can I take care of me, but how can I take care of Ruth? That selfless love, sacrificial love. Ruth, on the other hand, is like, how can I take care of Naomi? Not only can I provide food for her, but how can I restore her? How can I see that she's redeemed in her people? I'm not getting married for me, I'm getting married for my mother-in-law. Boaz shows sacrificial love because he's not the redeemer. There's another one closer. Boaz can be like, not my problem. It's somebody else's problem. But Boaz shows love like, I'm going to make it my problem. I'm going to make you important to me. I don't care what it costs me. I'm pursuing after you. This is about people loving other people more than themselves. And all of us have the opportunity to do that, married or not, to put others before ourselves. Again, the quality you want in a relationship, you have to have. If you want your spouse to love you, then you better love them more than they love you. That should be the best competition you ever have in your life, trying to outlove one another. Because nobody loses that competition. It's what God has called us to do. As we close today, I want to point out one last thing to you. In this story, we see Ruth uncovering Boaz's feet. And she lays down at his feet. But why does she do that? She does that for protection and provision. You see, she's trying to get Boaz to marry her, to be the redeemer, to restore her, to restore Naomi. And so in this act, she's submitting to Boaz saying, you can provide, you can protect. In other words, you will provide security for me and for Naomi. And whether or not you know it, each of us in this room are in that same precarious situation right now. You see, all of us need provision and protection. All of us have a need in our life for eternal security. The question is, will you recognize that? And will you humble yourselves enough to lay down at the foot, not the foot of any person, but the foot of Jesus Christ at that cross? Will you lay down and say, hey, Christ, in you alone can I find provision, protection, and eternal security? Will you step into that moment, into my life? Will you fill me with your goodness? Will you fill me with your grace? And will you provide for me what no one else can? You see, because he made that sacrifice out of love to choose each and every one of us to be redeemed back to him. The question is, are you willing to lay down your life and follow after?